On behalf of the National Archives and Records Administration, I welcome you to our Becoming America lecture series. This is the third of 18 lectures scheduled at the Richard Nixon Presidential Library and Museum. As one of only 14 presidential libraries operated by the National Archives and Records Administration, the subject of how America came to be, how we gained and secured our freedom, and created self-government is the essence of our mission. We believe that access to and education about our government allows Americans to understand their history so they can fully participate in shaping our future. This lecture is the brainchild of Dr. Jo Ellen Chatham, the director of the Center for Civics Education at Concordia University in Irvine. She and her colleagues have worked tirelessly to craft an educational and entertaining lecture series that we hope you will enjoy. Lectures will last 45 minutes with a question and answer format following. Please email me your questions at rachel.fisher@nara.gov, or if you're joining us in the audience today and you have a question, please reach out to one of our staff members here on site. Now please help me in welcoming Dr. Jo Ellen Chatham.
Thank you for joining us, and especially a great deal of appreciation to the Richard Nixon Presidential Library and Museum and the wonderful staff at the National Archives who've helped make this possible. We're looking at how we became what we are as Americans. In the next series, we'll focus on the Constitution. After that, we'll focus on the Bill of Rights. But tonight, we're going to look at the Articles of Confederation, which was our nation's first real attempt at union, and it didn't work out very well. And this evening, our speaker is Professor Volker Jansen. He's a professor of political science and history at California State University at Fullerton, and he has a long history of teaching. He received his advanced degrees from California University at Davis, and I think you're in for a real treat, and hopefully you'll learn some things this afternoon that you really may not have known about before. So Dr. Volker, or Dr. Jansen, please join us.
Good evening, and thank you for joining us in another installment of this lecture series. Today's topic, the Articles of Confederation, is a bit of an oddball in our series. After all, this program carries the title, How We Gained and Secured Freedom and Self-Government. The Articles, almost all would agree, did not gain or secure freedom, and they barely constituted self-government. Why bother then with such a clear moment of failure, such a short-lived dead end, such a dud in our grand narrative? Let me tell you why I personally am drawn to the history of this short-lived period between national independence and the ratification of our Constitution. And it has a little bit to do with my accent. I was born in Germany and lived there for the first half of my life. German history is the first national narrative I learned and that I grew up with. And you don't have to be a scholar of European history to know that German national history is a narrative of fits and starts, of dramatic turning points, of catastrophe, crime, destruction, and resurgence. My grandmother lived in 5 different Germanys, and she didn't even move. Here in America, when we tell our constitutional history, we begin our storytelling with the confidence in a happy ending. Students in my classes inevitably end their essays with a line that more or less concludes, and this is how we got to be so great. They, like many, see a straight line from July 1776 to their present. This myopic, historians would say, teleological view, in which we only follow the historical trails that lead us to the now, reassures us, builds our national confidence, and lets us believe that history really could not have turned out any other way. Of course, for those of us who have paid the least bit of attention since the presidential election of 2020, that confidence and self-assuredness will have withered away for good. The insurrection of January 6, 2021, and the broad popularity of the big lie of a stolen November election of 2020 tell us that this constitutional government may not be indestructible or perennial at all. Today, we will see that it was also not inevitable in the first place. Indeed, the origins of our Constitution are deeply embedded in uncertainty and instability. few of the founders would be able to relate to the self-assuredness that so many Americans continue to display when it comes to their constitutional form of government. In fact, the type and form of government we honor in this series was not a Wunschkind, the German word for child of choice, but born out of compromise in response to a decade of failure. Let's return to the title of this talk, Disunity in the Union. We may be led to think that unity among English colonists in North America was the normal state of affairs, only to be interrupted by external factors that caused division. In fact, though, it is the other way around. Consider the different motivations for different colonial enterprises. Massachusetts, Virginia, Pennsylvania, Georgia. I will not go into the details here. Different commitments to the practice of enslavement is but one of the differences that kept colonists separate. By European standards, English colonies were remarkably diverse religiously, demographically, and economically. They shared colonial governors and customs collectors, but their local governments and assemblies built on different traditions. For the longest time, their shared relationship to the British Empire reinforced these differences. At a time when London and England stood at the center of the colonists' world, all routes of information and transport served that imperial core. This meant that New Yorkers had little incentive to build roads to their Pennsylvania neighbors, or that Virginians would have wanted to build a shared community with North Carolinians to the south. Information and goods flowed from the Atlantic seaboard inland and back again across the Atlantic. Intercolonial exchanges relied almost entirely on seaports. When we look at Benjamin Franklin's warnings to his fellow North American colonists that they had to practice intercolonial solidarity to overcome the French-Indian alliance in the West in 1754, historians know this as the French-Indian War and later the 7 Years' War in the European context, we should bear in mind that Americans neglected his warning. Colonial alliances were a rare exception. In retrospect, we may dismiss these English colonists as narrow-minded and parochial. How could they not see their common cause? But recall the lives many colonists lived outside of seaport cities. They lived in a vast landscape without regular news sources or easy modes of transportation. Our look back at the English colonies is dominated by a bird's-eye view of colored maps that quite literally make sense of North American colonial lands as a coherent mass. Colonists at the time did not share this highly synthesized big picture. When Thomas Cole painted this scene in the New Hampshire mountains in 1836, he sought to convey the fragility of the human experience in a precarious landscape and capricious climate. But even though few English colonists lived in such dramatic settings at the time of the Revolution, they certainly shared the sense that their lives depended on local circumstances, and they sought local control above all else. So, before we judge the founding generation for their failure to see the appeal of unity, of one nation, of an American identity, let's bear in mind that they lived lives far apart from each other, without regular reinforcements of a shared cause and country in their news or material culture. There was no union to break. Of course, the imperial crisis forced many English colonists out of their isolation, inspired colonial delegations to seek common ground with their neighbors, prompted them to collaborate, cooperate, and conspire. The committees of correspondence were a novelty, the Continental Congress a clear act of rebellious collusion. Often establishing a sense of union within a colony was difficult enough. Recall the regulator movements in North Carolina, the land tenant revolts in New York, and, after all, before Congress commissioned and then signed the Declaration of Independence, states had the task of drafting their separate constitutions. Only then did the Continental Congress turn to the task of drafting the Articles of their Confederation. For John Adams, this looked like a daunting task. The colonies had grown up under constitutions of governments so different, there was so great a variety of religions, he lamented, they were composed of so many different nations, their customs, manners, and habits had so little resemblance, and their intercourse had been so rare, and their knowledge of each other so imperfect, that to unite them in the same principles in theory and the same system of action was certainly a very difficult enterprise. The drafters of the Articles wanted to ensure harmony and peace among the new American states and set themselves apart from a Europe in which rivaling nations, principalities, and short-lived alliances seemed at constant war. The Articles also had to provide a unity of government and force sufficient to withstand the British in the War for Independence and secure home rule. But that was the extent of it. Madison explained union as a necessity rather than a common virtue. The states, he wrote, resorted to union for the common safety against powerful neighbors and for the preservation of peace and justice among themselves. Not much more than that. So apparent was the importance of outside pressure for the union of the states that some feared the end of the war in the Treaty of Paris came too early in 1783. The Superintendent of Finance in the Confederation, Robert Morris, warned that a continuance of the war is necessary until our Confederation is more strongly knit, until a sense of the obligations to support it shall be more generally diffused amongst all ranks of American citizens. So, within those parameters, what were the bare necessities of a shared government? Congress agreed on the Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union in November 1777 and promised that Congress should have the power to wage war, conduct diplomacy, and arbitrate disputes between the states. This was submitted for ratification in 1777, and these articles remained provisional until they were ratified by all states. Now, smaller states wanted Congress to have the power to control and administer and sell Western lands on the other side of the Appalachians, for reasons we will discuss later. Maryland was the last holdout and only ratified on February 2nd, 1781. For this long, the Articles remained a provisional document. We can readily see here that the war with Britain and the need for alliances with other nations drove what could best be called an alliance or diplomatic assembly rather than a nation. The nature of a confederacy, rather than a collection of states inhabited by citizens of the same nation, is also reflected in the equal weight for all states in Congress. Each state had one delegation with one vote. How little sovereignty state legislatures were willing to surrender to this union is clear in the rules Congress imposed on itself in the Articles. Ratification of the Articles had to be unanimous, as did any amendment to the Articles. A supermajority of 9 out of 13 was necessary for any decision. The states did not endow their new confederacy with an executive branch that could enforce its will. And since the Articles asked Congress to arbitrate disputes between states, there were no provisions for a federal or confederate court. States conceded to join the Confederacy, but were generally unwilling, it seems, to do anything that its own government would not already do anyway. Americans at the time did not put their faith into the Confederation. We may observe the difficulty of securing a supermajority of 9 state delegations out of 13 for any decision in Congress. But often, Congress lacked the quorum to even operate. For that, at least 7 states had to deliver at least 2 delegates. In 1785, William Grayson of Virginia reported that state delegations would come forward and be very assiduous till they have carried some state job, and then decamp with precipitation, leaving the public business to shift for itself. In other words, no one stuck around to actually conduct the business of a national government. State delegates were not compensated by the Confederation, but by their state legislature, who also selected them. They had term limits, 3 years within any 6-year period, and as a result, these delegates had the business of states in mind and rarely thought on behalf of a national collective, which leading voices lamented. They complained about the inefficacy of the arrangement. Alexander Hamilton did so virtually from day one, as you can imagine, but many joined over the course of the years leading up to the Philadelphia Convention, predicting any early dissolution of these weak bonds. This hardly looked like a perpetual union. It was barely a marriage of convenience. If we extend this metaphor of a dating relationship, it might go as far as having a toothbrush in the partner's household. So, not a perpetual union by any measure. The most glaring omission in the Articles was the lack of any independent source of revenue for Congress. This seemed sensible at a time when patriots were fighting the authority of the British government to tax the colonies. Of course, they would be reluctant to delegate that same authority to the Confederation Congress, which was just another distant government as far as they were concerned. And so Congress could merely request funds from states. During the war, few states were either willing or able to meet those requisitions. After all, they were already raising taxes to generate state funds to conduct the war. This forced Congress to print paper money to meet its obligations. The nation lacked credibility to secure foreign loans, and there was not enough hard currency within the United States to serve as loans for the Continental Congress. So a printing press literally in the corner of Congress was the only way in which this provisional government under the Articles could create any money. And when you print money, the problem is that for a while, people have faith in that paper currency and believe in its value, but if it appears in abundance, the value quickly depreciates. And so as a result, by 1779, Congress had printed so much money that the continental dollar was worth only 5% of its face value. And that is where the expression comes from, it's not worth a continental. By 1780, Congress could no longer fund the Continental Army and had to ask the states instead to furnish their citizens that were serving in that army with the necessary supplies. Imagine for a second that scenario in a time of war where government can no longer fund its own army but has to ask states to please make sure that these soldiers are provided for. With the money press at an end, Congress was left asking states to pay their requisitions, kindly ask for state favors to make payments to the federal government, to the Confederation. Several factors complicated this process. First, there were no coercive powers. Congress could plead and ask, but states could deny and ignore, and they frequently did. States also wondered, if we pay our share, will the others do so too? Why should I be the first to pay? We can all imagine this kind of reluctance to make that commitment. Will tax increases to fund requisitions anger the constituencies? Many states worried already about the high tax burdens that they had put on their citizens at a time when they had promised to fight against increases in taxes. To now add an additional tax burden to fund Confederation requisitions seemed to be politically unwise. And then some wondered why not raise revenue with sales of Western lands, lands that were at the time claimed by large states like New York or Virginia, and we will get to that in a little bit. Why not raise revenue with import duties, others asked, or so-called imposts that would be levied at the nation's big ports, like, for example, New York City. While the states chose compliance or non-compliance based on their own preferences, the fragile Confederacy teetered on the brink of dissolution. The Newburgh Conspiracy, romanticized in this painting, perfectly illustrated how precarious the state of the Confederation was. By the end of 1782, disgruntled Continental officers sent a delegation to Congress demanding back pay and pensions, more than hinting at the use of force to secure their demands. For some, like Alexander Hamilton, Robert Morris, and Gouverneur Morris, no relation, this seemed the perfect crisis to induce an amendment that would provide Congress with some revenue-generating powers. Others, like the Virginian delegate Arthur Lee, resisted any concessions precisely because of this undue pressure. George Washington intervened effectively in this crisis, and the mutiny was averted. The story of his speech to the officers is popular because he apparently evoked emotions by putting on his glasses and emphasizing his frailty and the personal sacrifice that he had paid for this fragile nation that these officers now seemed to be willing to jeopardize. And that's why we see in this romanticized version the officer wiping off tears their eyes. Whether that exactly happened in that way, that may be questionable, but that is certainly the popular narrative of Washington's intervention. We cannot know whether the Confederation would have broken up under the duress of disgruntled marauding of veterans, but we certainly do know that other nations in their history turned into failed states under such circumstances. And again, I may refer to my birthplace of Germany, where veterans indeed posed that very danger. Congress made 6 requisitions on the states between October 1781 and August 1786, in part to pay its operating expenses, in part to pay off the debt that it had been able to acquire over the course of the war. On average, states complied 37% of the time. That sounds better than it was, though. Compliance was highest during times of war, even though it was hardest, because the shared crisis compelled this type of solidarity. After the war, the rate dropped notably. South Carolina, for instance, had allocated 52% of its annual revenue in 1783 to federal requisitions, but reduced that share to 28% in 1784, then cutting Congress out of its revenue plan entirely in 1785 and 1787. By the spring of 1787, states had paid 2/3 of the congressional requisitions from October 1781, 20% of those from September 1785, but only 2% of that from August 1786. The North Carolina delegation to Congress then observed soberly that we are at the eve of a bankruptcy and a total dissolution of government. Raising revenue from international commerce in the form of an import duty or impost might have alleviated the nation's severe financial crisis. And yet, Congress had not only no power of taxation, but no power to regulate foreign or interstate commerce. There was good reason to push for such a power. The exit from the empire had delivered to Americans what they had asked for, a trade without the impositions of Parliament in London. And that also meant exit from British trade. As a result, New Englanders were no longer participating in the carrying trade across the Atlantic, were no longer allowed to sell ships to the English. And prior to the American Revolution, the British carrying trade purchased 1/3 of its ships from New England. So as a result, Americans found themselves in a severe economic slump and an economic downturn. Some American goods were barred from English ports, and France and Spain followed suit with restrictions on American imports. Just because these powers had wanted the United States to acquire independence from Britain did not mean they wanted them to be prosperous. And Americans noticed this at this point in their history. The British had made the most out of the desperation of this young confederation and levied their own duties on any American goods that they accepted. For instance, one Boston lawyer noted that for any $1 million of tobacco exports, the British charged $300,000 in freight and charges. American emissaries sought a trade treaty with Britain, but this was an impossibility for several reasons. First, the question was, how would Congress be able to enforce it? And second, why would Britain commit to a trade treaty if it could play the former colonies against each other? As one delegate told an American emissary in London, why should we form a commercial treaty when we at present pocket all the advantages of the American commerce without a treaty? Individual states tried to retaliate. In a letter to Jefferson, James Madison called it little short of madness for Virginia to bar British imports or to impose enormous duties on them without the concurrence of other states. So here was Virginia, or was New York, trying to impose their impost duties and trying to recoup their revenue in their own individual agreements with Britain. But when these states, and these all were states with excellent ports, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, New York, Pennsylvania, enacted high duties on British trade, their neighbors, Connecticut, New Jersey, and Delaware, for instance, responded by establishing free ports. So here were states in competition with each other for trade with the British, the very nation that they had united to fight and gain their independence from. How did a state like New York then respond to this free port in New Jersey? Expand its import duties on foreign goods brought into New York from foreign states unless they had proven the goods had been carried by American shippers. That was the answer. So now New York was not only raising duties on ships that came from Britain, but also any ships from New Jersey that could not document that their foreign goods were carried by an American ship. So consider the embarrassment for any delegation in London or other European capital trying to secure a reasonable trade condition under these circumstances when states were fighting each other. The hostilities of interstate trade did not end there. Connecticut eventually imposed heavier duties on Connecticut eventually imposed heavier duties on imports from Massachusetts than of those from Great Britain. And in response to New York's duties on shipments on foreign goods from New Jersey, the state imposed a tax on New York's lighthouse at Sandy Hook. Sandy Hook is at the tip of Monmouth County in New Jersey and is important for ships coming into New York Harbor. It was built at a time when New Jersey and New York saw a common cause in enhancing that kind of trade. But under the Articles of Confederation and in competition for gaining revenue at ports, now New Jersey was taxing New York on its lighthouse in retaliation. That was the state of commerce then. There was another source of revenue for the Confederation that carried even larger potential for conflict, and that was the issue of Western lands. The hunger for Western land had almost doomed the Confederation from the outset, because after all, the colonies, at the time that they were colonies, had the prospect of Western expansion, and one of the grievances of the colonists, as you may recall, in 1763 was the curtailing of Western migration across the Appalachians in the Proclamation Order of 1763, in which Britain tried to contain future conflict with indigenous nations. That did not preclude Virginia, New York, Carolinas, and Georgia to aspire to expanding their territories, their states, all the way to the Mississippi. That was indeed what had been Maryland's major complaint and prompted it to hold out with its ratification of the Articles. Eventually, New York ceded land claims to the West that seemed really quite audacious, and instead just settled with lands all the way up to Lake Erie. Those were the lands of the Haudenosaunee. Virginia surrendered claims to the north and west of the Ohio River in return for securing Kentucky. North Carolina continued its claim on what would become Tennessee, and Georgia claimed all land south of there, west to the Mississippi. This is a very early map from 1784, and you can see the way in which, under the Articles of Confederation, states envisioned their own expansion westward. You also know some notable mistakes. For instance, New York is not marked here. There's reason to believe that the cartographer did this out of spite. So it's a sign of the tensions and conflicts amongst the states in more ways than one. The lands north of the Ohio River were going to be the federal domain, lands that were not claimed by any of the states. And these lands had to eventually secure their own government. This was a lesson, again, learned from British times, that distant lands with remote settlers, with little contact to the headquarters of government, were likely to cause divisions and conflict. That was the situation in North Carolina during colonial times, and when the regulator movement in the eastern part of the colony saw justice from a seaboard government out of touch with conditions further inland. These kind of conflicts people recognized they had to avoid in the future. The first step towards this was the Northwest Ordinance of 1784 that was drafted by Thomas Jefferson. And it subdivided these federal domains in this Northwest Territory in 10 territories, and originally envisioned that with 20,000 citizens, a Republican Constitution would be enacted, and they would receive the right to send a delegation to Congress. Once they reached the size of the smallest state, Rhode Island, they would become an equal partner in the Union. But they remained sort of murky about the exact conditions for statehood. In 1785, the Continental Congress, the Congress under the Confederation, passed its second accomplishment, and that was the Northwest Ordinance of 1785 that required prior surveys of the federal domain, and then dividing up the surveyed lands into townships 6 by 6 miles, subdivided into 36 sections of 640 acres. After surveyed, these lands were supposed to be sold at $1 per acre by section, so 640 acres was the smallest unit, in hard cash and paid out in full, so no sale on credit. The terms of land sales are always a political signal at the time, because whether you sell your land in small lots on credit or in small plots for hard cash decides whether you are favoring small settlers, aspiring people with little means, or whether you are indeed favoring speculators that would then take over the process of settlement for you. The Ohio Company was such a speculating venture. They were made up of New England veterans. They bought 2 million acres at heavy discounts despite the ordinance of 1785. They paid in the end about 10 cents per acre, and then resold at, you might say, retail prices to settlers who had to buy on credit. If you bear in mind that by, say, 1785, the amount of hard currency, meaning money that actually consisted of silver or gold, had shriveled to maybe a fifth of what had existed in 1776, when people were already complaining about a lack of currency. You can imagine how difficult it was for anyone to buy land in large amounts, and how select the number of speculators were that were able to go in on such a venture. To please investors further, the Confederation Congress issued a third ordinance in 1787 that amended Jefferson's original terms, which struck the speculators as far too democratic, having a Republican government with a population of 20,000, and these then being the pioneering settlers at that unsettled people at the Ohio Land Company and other speculating ventures. So, in fact, they established a territorial governor and an assembly with a population of 5,000, but one over which the governor maintained a veto. Then statehood would follow with 60,000. Richard Henry Lee of Virginia called this necessary for the security of property among uninformed and perhaps licentious people. So the perspectives on these Western settlers varied widely, where some were celebrated as pioneers, and yet other classes of seaboard state elites looked at these Western settlers as scum of the earth. Northwestern ordinances outlawed slavery in those territories, but also introduced the first form of fugitive slave law in order to allay the fear of Southerners. So these are two forms of pioneering legislation that we can detect in these Northwest ordinances. But these ordinances were written on paper. What happened on the ground looked often quite different. Settlers drove the westward march, and these settlers moved primarily into what Virginia claimed, and that was Kentucky. In 1783, there were 12,000 settlers in Kentucky. In 1790, there were 73,000. In order to avoid the kind of conflicts with indigenous nations that ultimately toppled the British Empire in this region, the Confederation Congress sent out emissaries to force land cessions from indigenous nations. And they did so with a lot of bluster and bold language, telling tribal chiefs that they were now a subdued people. The reality was that the Confederation Congress had no money at all to pay for any army to enforce any type of land claim in the West. So while the Confederation Congress claimed all sorts of lands, the reality on the ground remained that as long as indigenous people chose to stay there, there was very little that government would do about it. So in the end, it was settlers who engaged in atrocities that regionally often amounted to attempts at extermination. The Spanish in the territory of Louisiana were also worried about the western expansion that were driven by settlers in Kentucky and other parts, especially in the South. A Spanish governor regarded American settlers as distinguished from savages, and this is obviously how he refers to indigenous nations, only in their color, language, and the superiority of their depraved cunning and untrustworthiness. So that's what the Spanish thought of these Western squatters. The British also worried about American settlers and formed alliances with indigenous nations to hold their northwestern forts. And this was a source of grievance, especially for New York, which found itself stymied in its fur trade because the British remained on its western perimeter. In 1784, Spain tried to slow American expansion by closing New Orleans to settlers' commerce via the Mississippi. Now, and this had severe consequences, both for the national conversation and also for the political narrative at the time. For anyone moving into these Western lands across the Appalachians, any future prosperity depended on finding some commercial venture, which inevitably had to involve agriculture. And this commercial agriculture meant that you wanted to transport and sell your goods at a market that could not be in Kentucky because it was just you who was out there. So after living in a subsistence style of farming, any commercial venture required you to transport your goods. And the obvious path here was not across the Appalachians, the mountain range, but down on the Ohio River into the Mississippi and then to New Orleans. Without such a potential for transporting your cargo, the land values in places like Tennessee or Kentucky would inevitably fall because who would want to farm there? Local farmers came up with compromises and found solutions to ways to market their grain without bulk shipments on rivers, and that was, of course, spirits, liquor. So that explains the Kentucky tradition of bourbon. The Spanish were aware of the importance that the river network had for the transportation and the prospects for these Western settlers, and explicitly invited Westerners to consider leaving the United States and associating instead with the Spanish Empire. And today we might think this unlikely and incredible, but at the time, the possibility of losing access to these rivers concerned many Western settlers deeply, and the Articles of Confederation did not create a national cohesion that inspired some sort of a national spirit of solidarity and an outrage at this suggestion. Benjamin Rush, in fact, said there's but one path that can lead the United States to destruction, and that is their extent of the territory. So in order to avoid this kind of calamity out in the West, Congress sent John Jay to negotiate with Don Diego de Gardoqui, who was the Spanish emissary to Washington, D.C. And the goals were twofold. On the one hand, secure and maintain access to the Mississippi for Western settlers, and second, secure a trade treaty with Spain. The trade treaty was in particular interest for northern states who were engaged in the cod trade, and cod fishing had generated significant revenue for New England states when it was sold to Britain. Now that Britain had blocked cod imports from the Confederation, New Englanders were looking for a new market, and Spain was fond of cod. For Southerners, of course, the access to the Mississippi was important because most of these Western settlers were, in fact, Southerners, came out of the Carolinas and out of Virginia. And for some Southern states, it seemed like an extension of their political culture. And indeed, there was much hope among Southerners that these states would eventually expand the Southern voting bloc in the Confederation and then what would later become the United States Congress. These divisions were not entirely uniform. There were some Northerners in New Jersey, for instance, who suggested that indeed what could forego the treaty, the trade treaty with Spain, and instead focus on securing land in the Mississippi, because those increasing land values that would travel all the way up the Mississippi River Valley, even north of the Ohio River Valley, would increase land values and thereby generate revenue that then New Jersey wouldn't have to raise with taxes. So they said there's an economic argument to be made to hold on to the access to the Mississippi and maintain that land value and avoid us having to raise taxes on our citizens. And there were some Southerners who feared that this move westward would indeed lead to a secession and the breakup. George Washington, for instance, suggested that instead of relying on the Mississippi, we should instead invest in the building of canals that would cross the Appalachians and would allow Kentuckians to sell their product to the east and thereby tie more closely to the original 13 states. Jay found himself between two increasingly bitter factions that distrusted him, and especially the South worried that he was willing to sell the Southern cause, Southern and Western cause, away for some frivolous trade benefits with Spain. Northerners, on the other hand, feared and argued that resisting and rejecting a trade treaty with Spain would possibly provoke a war that Jay said there was no way the Confederation Congress could fund. There was no way that that nation could go to war. These negotiations endured for a while and eventually ended up nowhere, in part because the events at the Philadelphia Convention overtook this process. But it highlighted conflicts within the Confederation Congress that showed the danger of secession and the deepening sense of sectional conflict between North and South. Now, of course, it was clear to many that these articles required an amendment. This amendment was difficult to do because A, it had to be unanimous, and C, there had to be a quorum. And then finally, any amendment had to be really quite specific, because under the Articles, Congress was only permitted to exercise full and explicit powers. So there was very little wiggle room or leeway in any amendment adopted. Over the course of the 1780s, Congress proposed several amendments to expand its powers, but none ever secured the unanimous consent required for ratification. Hamilton explained in 1783 that the road to popularity in each state is to inspire jealousies of the power of Congress, though nothing can be more apparent than that Congress has no power. Nonetheless, the path to political popularity and office was to lament the powers of Congress, and so the chances of these delegates who were chosen by the state legislatures to ever support an amendment were low. Nonetheless, Congress tried on several occasions. And the first was a fairly modest impost amendment that suggested that states forego their own import duties and instead embrace a national impost duty of a modest 5%. It had a sunset provision, meaning it would only be there for about 15 years. Issued in 1780, after a year of delay, Rhode Island, the last state to vote, rejected this amendment. Rhode Island had 1/60th of the nation's population, but blocked this modest effort at securing some revenue for the government and claimed to be entitled to make its own impost duties and make itself whole with its ports, given that it had lost 147 out of its 150 ships during the Revolutionary War. A second time around, in 1783, it was New York that was the holdout. It was a surprising turn of events. During the first time around, New York was occupied by the British. Its war was going very badly, and a joint effort made a lot of sense to New Yorkers. So New Yorkers were on board with the Impost Amendment of 1780. But in 1783, the British had left New York, the war was over, and the state legislature issued its own import duties that ended up funding 1/3 to 1/2 of the state's operating expenses. So New York was doing very well with its own import duties. That allowed the state to keep its real estate taxes low, and as a result, also sustain inner peace. We see later on what high property taxes do to domestic tranquility in a state like Massachusetts, for instance. New Yorkers also had some other resentments against the Congress, which also made it likely that they were going to, at some point, stand in the way. And that is what happened. In 1785, again, a congressional committee proposed an even broader amendment that would grant Congress the power to regulate commerce. But Southerners were now adamant that commerce was a sectional issue, that Southerners looked for low import duties and depended on imports for most of its manufactured goods. For Northerners, it was the other way around. Northerners were eager to manufacture and export and protect their own manufacturing with high import duties. So they were diametrically opposed on this issue. There were 5 southern states: Georgia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Virginia, and Maryland. As a result, these 5 were always able, for now, to block a supermajority under the Articles of Confederation, because there were only 8 states to their north. But it only took one southern state to ever gain some concession or be lured over into the northern camp, and the entire southern sectional position on trade policy would fall. So some Southerners wondered how long this confederation could really endure with all 13 states. And with Southern talk about a possible second Southern Confederation, some Northerners said that maybe that was indeed what had to happen, a future with 2 confederations. Thus, by the fall of 1786, national political leaders as different as James Madison and Alexander Hamilton agreed that, as the former wrote his father in another context, we have not a government to wield and correct. And this is why these 2 leaders asked a group of members of Congress to meet at Annapolis in September 1786 to form an argument for a broader appeal of the Articles of Confederation that would then happen in spring 1787. This brings us to the final episode in this escalating crisis in the Articles of Confederation. By 1786, the crisis over requisitions, access to the Mississippi, and commerce had reached a high point. At the same time, over these past 10 years, the nation's economy had suffered severely. Most historians would say that this was probably the most severe economic depression prior to the Great Depression of the 1930s. Farmers saw their sales decline, being excluded from the British Empire. They saw falling prices because of a lack of currency and because of the economic depression and the general malaise in agriculture. They saw the land values fall as well. At the same time, they faced higher taxes in a situation far worse than during the imperial crisis of the later 1760s or 1770s. So here were farmers in western Massachusetts being asked to pay high taxes at a time when they remembered clearly that what they had fought for was a government with low taxes. The farmers that marched out and wanted to close the courts to prevent the liquidation of properties and the foreclosures on farms seemed to suggest some state of anarchy. And in fact, many people in the nation felt that this was the end of this experiment. This was a failed state. The end to the Shays' Rebellion, to the band of farmers under Shays that marched on Springfield to secure weapons at the armory, came not with a Continental Army, because Congress could not pay for a Continental Army. It could not recruit a single soldier to defend order in Massachusetts. It was, for once, the state militia that prevented this escalating further. This was what in many observers' eyes at the time was the pinnacle that illustrated not the military incompetence of the Congress under the Articles of Confederation, not the lack of military power, but the financial impotence of a nation and the capriciousness of state finances that made situations so fragile that something like Shays' Rebellion could even happen. So at this point, James Madison concluded that the existing embarrassments and mortal diseases of the Confederacy form the only ground of hope that a spirit of concession on all sides may be produced by the general chaos, or at least partition of the Union, which offers itself as the alternative. So Madison's hope was here that this crisis might hopefully either lead to a split of the Confederation into two sections or a whole new form of government, a whole new governmental document. Thank you.
Okay, so we have one question from Will online, and the question is, what was the public sentiment regarding the Articles of Confederation throughout the states?
Oh, throughout the states? That's, of course, a complicated question. In general, these early Americans had little interest in the Confederation. The Confederation was created for the sake of a common defense, and that was the baseline. There was no broader aspiration to make this Confederation much more than that. So when an ordinary citizen in Pennsylvania had been asked about what they think about the Articles of Confederation, they would have probably said, well, it's not doing us much good. And they weren't entirely wrong about this. Neither did these people want to do anything to make it a stronger government either. So if they said it's not doing us much good, they would have also said, and that's fine, we just wish it was gone entirely. So there was no love for this type of government in most parts of the nation.
Okay, well, thank you. And that's the end of our question and answer segment. I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you. As I said at the beginning, the reason this matters is because we take for granted a constitutional government that emerged out of a quest for independence. And the details of the story suggest that this was anything but that an American identity did not yet exist. There was no sense of a shared nationhood that we today take for granted. In fact, a nation had to be made, and that job was not yet done. In fact, it wouldn't yet be done with the Constitution itself. Thank you.
Thank you.